Well, my name is Chris Deacy. Welcome to this talk. Obviously, because of the coronavirus pandemic, we're not able to meet in person, but I'm just going to talk about some of the modules that I run here at the University of Kent. One of the most popular courses is called Death and the Afterlife, and we look at questions around heaven and hell. What do Jews think about heaven and hell? What do Muslims think about the afterlife? How do Christians conceptualize life after death? And one of the most enjoyable topics, I think, or one of the ones that the students really get stuck into, is when we look at out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. So what I would do in a classic lecture is take you through some of the main sources, looking at statistics along the lines, for example, that 1 in 10 people have had a near-death experience at some point in their lives. We would look at some of the evidence for this, looking at what happens in hospitals and some of the claims that have been made about people who have come back from having experienced death. And what we will also do, for example, is look at how films and filmmakers have so much to contribute to this topic. So often it's not just a case of what do philosophers and what do theologians think about the afterlife, but what is it that filmmakers are saying? And how does that cultural impact generate a lot of important insights for theologians and philosophers and religious studies scholars to engage with. So we might, for example, look at what an individual like Paul Badham, who is a professor of theology, who does a lot of work in the area of eschatology and life after death, and what this says about questions of survival, and then apply it to a film like Flatliners from 1990. And there was a remake in 2017, and seeing how a bunch of medical students have conceptualized questions about life after death and trying to experience what it's like when their heart stops and the experiences that follow. And the film is quite a mishmash of Christian and Buddhist perspectives on the afterlife. So we'll look at various data. What is it that people who've had a near-death experience think happens to them? So we might look, for example, at Carol Zaleski, who looks at various motifs: separation from the body, an encounter with deceased relatives and friends, an immersion in light and love, transforming after effects. That's one of the key characteristics. We see this also with this slide here from Fenwick and Fenwick. Very interesting that many of those who've experienced life after death will say that something has changed in them so that they don't fear anymore what might happen after they die, and there's a renewal of friendship and community, and not necessarily religious faith, but a sense that they want to live life to the full. So this applies to atheists as well as people who have a religious faith. So we might look at how having a near-death experience will confirm some form of an afterlife. We'll look at all sorts of neurological explanations, arguments around extinction, as well as arguments for what life after death shows. We might look at Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, for example, which has a wonderful journey motif, almost a near-death experience, as Scrooge is afforded this great opportunity to see what is going to happen to him. His past, his present, his future. Can he change the future? So we might look at a range of films from Flatliners and Dragonfly and White Noise. We'll look at the limitations that are involved here, and what are many of the skeptics, Susan Blackmore being one of the most obvious cases in point here, what she thinks about whether only religious people have experienced life after death, or claim that near-death experiences have been efficacious. We look at the neuroscientific perspectives, which, for example, and very much Susan Blackmore, very much the Richard Dawkins of the area around thanatology and life after death, and she presents a much more naturalistic perspective, which is how it's about oxygen deprivation. So she thinks that we imagine what happens when our body starts to shut down, and she thinks that anything from prior knowledge, lucky guesses and fantasy are all part of this perspective here. So something very reductionistic going on. We can account for out-of-body and near-death experiences in psychological terms. She says that fantasies and imagery might become more stable than our present sensory model, and so therefore seem real. So we will look at responses to some of these perspectives, and we'll really have a good discussion in class around some of the pastoral issues around near-death experiences and life after death. What happens when we die? Do we want to imagine survival? Do we want to imagine that after we die something happens to us? Or is the idea of extinction and cessation actually more palatable to us? So if you are interested in coming to the University of Kent, to study religious studies, this is just one of the many perspectives that we're able to experiment with. So I really hope to meet you all in person in due course. Thank you very much.